So there are dire wolves living on Earth right now. They were born after thousands of years, and it's thanks to the work of the person I'm just about to speak to. Beth Shapiro is the chief science officer at Colossal Biosciences, and she helped to bring back the dire wolf, or as others call it, a gray wolf with 20 genetic edits. There is a fierce debate about what de-extinction even means, and we'll get into that. But whatever you call them, there are now 3 big wolves living in an undisclosed location right now, and they wouldn't be there if not for the DNA that Beth and her team edited. And Colossal is also working to bring back the woolly mammoth, the Tasmanian tiger, and the Dodo bird, and other animals that have long been extinct. Why? Well, we'll get into it during this special edition of Future Around and Find Out, recorded live from PopTech. And Beth will also share what it's like working on a moonshot like this and what fellow ambitious builders can do to improve the odds of their own moonshots. Welcome to Future Around and Find Out, where we celebrate the breakthroughs, call BS on the hype, and explore how things might go sideways and how we, together, can steer the future in the right direction. Hi, I'm Dan Blumberg. I'm an independent technologist and former NPR journalist, and on the show, you'll hear sharp takes on what builders need to know now. Learn more, sign up for the newsletter, and ask questions of upcoming guests at futurearound.com. This is going to be the most Oprah question that I've ever asked a guest on the show. At Colossal, is it the journey or is it the destination? I know that the destination, the big goal is bring back the woolly mammoth, but there's a lot of problems you're going to solve along the way. And is the woolly mammoth, do we need woolly mammoths to come back, or is it just that it just is a forcing function for us to learn so much and solve so many other problems as we get there?
How is that an Oprah question?
I feel like the journey and destination, isn't that kind of Oprah speak?
It's more like The Bachelor, right?
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
We're talking about The Bachelor.
Okay.
No, that's a good question. It's never really been posed to me that way. Although one of the things that I really like about the way we've designed the journey is we've picked the mammoth, which is a placental mammal, the thylacine, which is also the Tasmanian tiger, that's a marsupial mammal, and initially the dodo, which is a bird. Now we have 2 birds. We've also launched a MOA project. So we have these 3 different paths, and every one of these species that's a candidate for de-extinction has a different set of technical, ethical, ecological, social challenges that we need to solve. And I think one of the fascinating things about the biodiversity problem, and to me, all of this is addressing the crisis of biodiversity loss and has the potential to address other crises that we can talk about. But one of the things that I've seen is that you go to meetings like this one, or you go to meetings with thought leaders in Europe, and you're talking about the challenges that are out there, and everybody says, yes, this is terrible. We're running out of space. There's not enough arable land. There are habitats that are degraded. There are species that are going extinct. And then they start wringing their hands about what to do. The problem is too big. There's too much out there that we have to try to solve at the same time. What this does is it says, here is this crazy goal that we have. We're going to bring mammoths and thylacines and dodos back to life. How do we even do this? And we have to write down all of these challenges, all of the technical things that we need to solve to be able to transform an Asian elephant into a mammoth or a Nicobar pigeon into a dodo. We have to write down all of the regulatory challenges that we face in different parts of the world. How do we bring together people to agree with what we want? How do we learn enough ecologically about how habitats might be made suitable for these species? And we have to actually write them down as a big giant list. And that means we can start focusing on them one at a time and actually solving them. So it is the journey, but it's the end product that allows us to have that journey.
So the Apollo mission is referenced a lot at Colossal. It's all over the website as an example of a big mission that also forced a lot of other breakthroughs to happen in order for us to get to the moon. I'm curious, what are some of the biological equivalents of some of the things that we got from trying to get to the moon? Things like digital flight controls and enhanced food safety and rechargeable hearing aids are some of the things that came out of the Apollo mission. What are some of the problems that we're going to benefit from, whether or not we ever bring back a mammoth or not, that will make us happier here on Earth?
I think some of the simplest to look to are just some of the biological innovations that are coming out of the work we're doing already, the technical hurdles that we've overcome. We announced that our avian team discovered the recipe for keeping a type of cell called a primordial germ cell alive in a dish in the lab. This is really important for bird de-extinction, but also for using any of the tools of genome engineering to help birds that are still alive avoid becoming extinct. We did not have that technology for any bird except for chickens, but our team figured out the recipe for pigeons. The dodo was a pigeon. Anyone who didn't know that is going to be disappointed by that, but it probably won't be the most disappointing thing I say in this conversation. But there you go. The dodo was a pigeon. Cool pigeon. See, it's good.
Oh, nice.
My favorite pigeon. So now that we have the recipe, we have made a huge step toward being able to bring back the dodo, but we've also opened up this technology to be able to use genome engineering on lots of different bird species for the first time. So that's an example of one biological innovation that we're going to get.
At Colossal, you focus on charismatic animals. And so at the risk of making my kids and probably your kids cringe, why is Riz so important at Colossal?
I have a middle schooler as well. You have a middle schooler? Yeah. Why is Riz so important? Well, I don't think Colossal is unique in the world of companies, nonprofits, organizations who are focused on bringing attention to the biodiversity crisis and extinction crisis using charismatic animals. I mean, the conservation community has been doing this for as long as we've been doing conservation.
Right.
You have to have people care. I think most people actually don't care about extinction in as much as it doesn't impact them personally, but they do care about a good story. And if you can capture somebody's attention and tell them why it's important to them, maybe they stick around. So I don't begrudge anybody using charismatic animals or charismatic storytelling as a way of bringing people in and then hooking them before telling them the information that you hope that they really can come away with.
Yeah. So on that topic, you've recently, the reason you were on Joe Rogan's and lots of other podcasts and did a lot of use your broadcast journalism skills a lot recently is because you brought back the direwolf.
That's right.
And they're three.
Yes.
Have you seen Remus and Romulus recently? How are they? How charismatic are they?
They are great. Romulus and Remus turned 1, and they had a birthday cake with all sorts of really weird textured things that they haven't seen before. So you got to see them really interested in what was going on there, taking bits and pieces of it away. You can find it on YouTube. It's pretty cool. Khaleesi, she is younger than the brothers. I saw Khaleesi last, I think it was maybe June, maybe a little bit earlier than that. She was still at the point where she's like a big doofy dog puppy when I saw her last. She runs up to you and she wants to put her hands on your shoulders and sort of lick and chew on your collar, and you think to yourself, oh my God, this giant wolf is chewing on my collar. But she's just a puppy. The boys were starting to behave more wolf-like. We went into the enclosure with them at the time, but they stayed away from us. It's really fascinating. They're clones. They're identical to each other, but they have very different personalities, wolfalities, I guess, if you will. Romulus used to be the dominant one. He was slightly larger when they were born, and he would be much less wary of people coming into the place. But now he really stands back. And Remus, if you're still alone for a while, Remus will eventually come up and sniff around you. But this is much more typical wolf-like behavior. Now, all three of them were hand-reared. They're never going to exhibit genuine wolf-like behavior because they just weren't raised in an environment that facilitates that. But it's been really fascinating watching them change as they get older.
Yeah. When the pups were born and there was the big media moment that the direwolf was back, it was met with a bunch of controversy as well, with some people saying these are not direwolves, these are gray wolves with 20 genetic edits. Is this a distinction without difference? Is approximation the point? I know I've heard you say in the past, like, we're not going to recreate 100% what came before us, and even you're mentioning they're being raised by hand. They're not, they don't have
this
moms
first generation,
and dads.
and obviously for direwolves, where we don't have any intention of releasing them into the wild, instead we're studying them. I mean, the responsible thing to do now, if you look at the documents that were written by the IUCN committee that was created to think about the possibility of de-extinction, they point out that now we need to study them and assess the impact of the edits on their lifespan, on their health span, on their, how they're interacting with each other and their environment. And direwolves, we have indigenous partners who are interested in having long-term care over a small population of direwolves, and that might be the future. They're still on this protected, large, expansive ecological reserve where we're just studying them and making sure that they stay healthy. And
undisclosed location,
because people can be terrible, right? So yes, keep them safe, right? But for the other species, the goal is ultimately to reintroduce them into the habitat where they can function like they are a wild population. I mean, we have, for the Dodo project, for example, we're working with community group, Mauritius Dodo Advisory Council, which includes politicians, people who work for the conservation organizations, school teachers. We have some students, just regular community members who are interested in helping us figure out where they should go, how many there should be, what the timing should be for releasing them in different stages. Obviously, these very first stages will have to have some sort of oversight, but eventually the goal will be that they'll be wild. And we anticipate that behaviorally that will change, because the less impact that we can have on them, the more wild they're going to be. So Colossal is a de-extinction company, but we're also a species preservation company. And what I am thinking about, what our teams are thinking about, is how can we resurrect specific traits of extinct species that we can put back into these habitats in order to restore interactions between organisms in that community that have been lost due to extinction. People who were saying to us, in order to call it a direwolf, you have to make every change that existed in a direwolf. You can say to them, well, which one? We had two direwolves. They differed from each other in millions, tens of millions, probably, maybe hundreds of millions of different mutations, variations. You and I are both human, but we differ a lot in our DNA sequence. But those differences are not what's important to making us human. And the differences between these direwolves are not what's important to making them have the traits that we were focusing on bringing back. And so my job is to make the fewest number of edits possible in order to bring back the target traits so we can restore these species to the ecosystem. We call them direwolves because they fill that function. If somebody else doesn't want to call them a direwolf, that's fine. But the ecosystem doesn't care at all about our nomenclature, right? The ecosystem could care less about human taxonomy and names. And that's really the way I'm thinking about it as well.
Yeah. And they are objectively bigger than a gray wolf would be at this point in their life, right? There are a lot of differences. You've now seen that they're a year old.
We were focusing on size, musculature, and the hair color. This is actually, I think, an important story that kind of got lost a little bit in the controversy. So one of the things that we did, one of the things that we discovered when we sequenced the genomes of the two fossil direwolves, we saw that both of these direwolves have variation. They had an allele in a gene that would have meant they had a light-colored coat. And so we thought, well, this is a really interesting thing. There's no way to know if all direwolves had light-colored coats, but these are two animals that lived 60,000 years different from each other in different parts of the US, and they both had light-colored coats. So perhaps it was at least a predominant coat color among direwolves. So why not pick this as a phenotype that we can engineer, and then we know that we will be successful because we can see them. And if they have light-colored coats, we know that the edits that we made to their DNA caused that.
Yeah.
And so we decided we were going to use this, but there was a problem. So we looked at this gene, and we looked at the gray wolf, the spectrum of gray wolf genetic diversity. And this is one of the reasons that direwolf was such a great first example, because outside of model organisms like mice and fruit flies and the things that people study in labs, we know a lot about the DNA of gray wolves because we all have a favorite gray wolf. Normally, it's called Fido or Coda, and it lives in our house and runs around our feet, right? So domestic dogs are gray wolves. So we know a lot about them. So we get to use all of that information to make more informed decisions about how we're going to engineer these animals to bring back these direwolf traits. So if you look around gray wolves, there are individuals who have edits in this same gene that we know means that direwolves had light-colored coats. It's not exactly the same variants as we saw in direwolves, but it's the same gene, and these edits can cause deafness or blindness. And so we made the decision that we would not use that path because it would be potentially not safe for the animals. They would end up with a not healthy animal. And because there are dogs and wolves with light-colored coats, we knew that we could create this light-colored coat using a different pathway that is safe on a gray wolf genetic background because there are healthy gray wolves that have those genetic alleles. And so we chose those edits as the path to make our light-colored direwolves. So I think this really explains both the challenge that we're facing. Every edit that we make carries some small risk of not playing well in the background of the surrogate genomic environment. And we have to do everything in our power to make sure that when we make these edits, that we end up with a healthy animal, right? Animal welfare is absolutely top of mind.
Why do we want dodos back? Why do we want woolly mammoths back? What are some of the considerations as you pick animals, talk to the communities that you've talked to, and figure out, like, because it's not just a scientific challenge, it's an ecosystem challenge, it's a cultural challenge. There are many other considerations. So I guess two questions here: why do we want these animals back, and then what other things beyond the incredible science you're doing do we need to get right to bring them back?
Those are very big questions, especially the second part of it. What else do we need to do to be able to have them here? I think for me, the selection of species there's multiple ways to think of it. First of all, is it technically possible? Can we get ancient DNA? So if we can't get ancient DNA from something, then it's pretty much a no-go for right now. So we can't figure out what the genome looked like. If we don't understand why they went extinct in the first place, then that's a problem, because we would need to solve whatever caused the extinction in the first place in order to know that they wouldn't just go extinct again. For the dodo, this is a big problem, because dodos went extinct within just a couple of decades of the first appearance of people in Mauritius. It's the only place that dodos lived. And it wasn't because people hunted them or ate them. In fact, some of the earliest records of them suggest that they didn't taste particularly good. But it was because a dodo can't fly, and it lays a single egg in a nest on the ground. And when people arrived in Mauritius, they brought things like cats and dogs and pigs and rats accidentally, and all these animals just ate the egg, and so they couldn't reproduce. And now there are rats and monkeys and all sorts of introduced species in different habitats in Mauritius that we would need to figure out how to control for before we can reintroduce these species. We don't know all of the interactions that a dodo would have had on a landscape, but we anticipate that restoring a large ground-dwelling, fruit-eating bird will have impact to this ecosystem that will also help to restore this species. And in Mauritius in particular, there's another motivation, which is ecotourism. So the people are very interested in the possibility of turning this currently an icon of the dangers of human colonization and human-caused extinctions into an icon of what we can do if we come together and decide that we want to restore some of these habitats in different ways. And they're super excited about the role that Mauritius can play in changing that story, and then also bringing people to Mauritius to show them how it can change the landscape. So I think every one of these species has a different reason, a different motivation for bringing them back, but also different challenges that are involved with this. The Tasmanian tiger is another example. This was the thylacine. This was the top carnivore of the habitat, this community of organisms in Australia. It's been extinct now for over 100 years. That's all. And it hasn't been replaced in that ecosystem. And we can look to the story of the reintroduction of the gray wolf to Yellowstone to understand the tremendous cascading impact that restoring the top carnivore of an ecosystem can have if we can bring that back into the landscape. One of the hypotheses is that this top carnivore may have been really important in keeping the facial tumor disease that the devils get at low levels in the population by weeding out the sick individuals.
So we need more predators sometimes.
Sometimes we need more predators. And so restoring that animal to that ecosystem is intended to restore those interactions and to help make that ecosystem more robust, more resilient as we move into the future.
Yeah. And I'm curious to dig in a little bit to the science of how this is being done and sort of the evolution of technologies that, make this possible now, when maybe it wasn't possible. You tell me how many years ago.
I think all of the core technologies that we need to make this happen exist and have existed relatively recently. We have genome engineering technologies. We've had that for a long time. It all of a sudden becomes much simpler with CRISPR because you can design very readily the guide sequences that you need to tell the molecule where in the genome to go to make the change that you want it to go. And now there are different types of CRISPR that don't cut both strands of DNA, which means that the genome can remain intact. If you use the regular, old school CRISPR, old school, it's funny because it's not actually that old.
Yeah.
Use old school CRISPR, cuts both strands of DNA, and then the DNA has to repair itself. And we're going to need to make thousands, maybe tens of thousands of changes simultaneously. And if you cut a genome at that many places at the same time, it'll just fall apart. The cell will not survive. Just won't know how to recover. But if we only cut one strand and keep the other one intact, then we get to the point where we're starting to be able to make multiple genome edits simultaneously. Our Mammoth team, for example, is doing an experiment right now where they're doing almost 200 edits simultaneously to cells, elephant cells, growing in dishes in labs to change lots of things simultaneously, and really pushing this gene editing technology forward. We also need to be able to learn, I think this is probably the hardest problem in biology right now, and this is something that large language models, machine learning, AI are really going to help us with. How do we know which letters of the DNA code are responsible for making a particular organism look or act the way they do? This is something we know for some things. We can do this for hair color, for example. We were able to figure out the hair color of our dire wolves, and we know how to do hair color in gray wolves and in people. But things like height or skin color in humans, we know that these are all characteristics that are coded for by lots of genes simultaneously. And maybe it's not changes in the coding sequence, but it's changes in how those genes are regulated, turned up or turned down, or the timing at which they're turned up or turned down during development. And we really are at the very early stages of being able to decode the genome. We have a lot of genome sequences now, and we have a lot of data from gene expression that we've gotten from model organisms, and they exist on the web. And so turning AI and LLMs on to taking that information and turning it into answers for us, I think is really going to push this technology forward.
Yeah.
There's a lot of animal reproductive biology that we need to know as well. And this is another example of how the innovations in de-extinction are applicable immediately to conservation efforts. In order to make a mammoth, we have to learn about elephant reproductive biology, about what keeps elephants happy and healthy in captive breeding environments, about how to use elephants to make more elephants. And so on the path to eventually someday having a mammoth, we hope to, in the much more not so distant future, have ways of helping elephants, right? So
Yeah. I want to ask about you brought up the ethics of not bringing back, a dire wolf that's blind or deaf, or the ethics of just reintroducing them at all. That's a big question. And I'm curious if you could answer the question in a bit of a generalized way for other builders out there who are not working on de-extinction, but they are working on AI or some other, big uncertain thing that has both, great positive effects and, also externalities. What is the approach that you use to decide, not can we do this, but should we do this?
It's an interesting question. When I think about this, what I see is that we are facing multiple crises. We have the biodiversity crisis, the extinction crisis. We have a crisis of declining amounts of arable land that we can turn into agriculture. And we have the potential of all of these biotechnologies. We can choose to say that biotechnological innovations using genome engineering to make crops be able to turn more carbon and nitrogen more readily into more people, to be able to feed people, feed the animals that we rely on, or to be able to stop species from becoming extinct, that we don't want to do that because it's risky. I would also like to point out that choosing not to do that is a choice. And I think a lot of times we see this as we're making a choice or there isn't another option. But the other choice, to not at least explore the potential of these technologies to be able to solve some of these problems that we are facing, has consequences. And from an extinction biodiversity perspective, we know what those consequences are. The consequences that we will just continue to lose species. We will continue to lose land. People will starve to death. I don't want to take that risk when I could use this opportunity to evaluate what these tools are. I'm not saying it should be done outside of any sort of regulatory framework or we shouldn't consider risks, but we absolutely must acknowledge that we're taking a tremendous risk if we just decide we're too scared to try that.
I'm curious if you have other advice for builders out there who are working on their own moonshots, long time horizon projects, in terms of how you organize the team, how you keep them motivated, just anything that would apply to, moonshots sort of generally.
I think people who are working in this kind of space need to think of themselves as explorers. I think, we live in a time where most of the world has been seen. It's hard to imagine how you can jump into a thing that you're doing for the first time, that where you have the potential to change the course of history in some small way or maybe some large way. And like any explorer, you have to be brave, you have to be willing to take risks, but you also have to be willing to celebrate when things go right. So much focus on risk and so much focus on attention from people who just are opposed to what you're doing because they don't like the idea of risk. You just have to ignore it. You have to remember why you're in it, remember what's exciting about it, and keep your eye on the goal, but celebrate the small wins.
What was it that first drew you to be so passionate about, fascinated by ancient DNA, so much so that you have a tattoo on your arm there and eventually drew you to Colossal?
So I wanted to be a broadcast journalist, and I was working professionally in broadcast journalism when I was in high school. When I went to university, I went to the University of Georgia. They have a great journalism school. I got a job as the news director at a local radio station. I did that for a while. It was not very compatible with living in a dorm because I had to be at work at 4 a.m. That, this is really
I know that very well. I used to have to be at work at 4 a.m. myself to produce morning radio.
Yeah, so that was a lot. I took a class after my first year at Georgia, and it was a geology and anthropology or geology and archaeology class, and it was a field program. So we started off on the East Coast, and we learned about geological dynamics of the East Coast ocean, and we learned about rocks and minerals. And then we drove across the country, and we slept in national parks, and we visited historical sites. And I started to see all of the changes that people had brought about in the world that was very new to me. The bigness of the world was very new to me at the time. Lived a little slightly sheltered life growing up in Northwest Georgia. And I thought to myself, you could see the way the habitat had changed as a consequence of ice ages, then the way the habitat changed with the first appearance of people, and then subsequent waves of people moving across the country, and then the arrival of Europeans and the extinction of the megafauna. And I thought, we are so powerful people in what we do to everything else that we encounter as we are moving. Mm-hmm. We need to be more aware of this and about how we are actually controlling, in charge of everything's future. That's the kind of journalist I want to be. Those are the stories I want to tell. And so I decided that I would get a degree in science. And then I met this guy who was starting up a lab in a brand new field called ancient DNA. It was the late 1990s. And this was new, this idea that you could get a ton of information out of fossils and remains of plants and animals that used to be alive and use that to reconstruct snapshots of evolutionary history. And it combined my real joy in geology and paleontology and evolution, and then introduced me to molecular biology that I had absolutely no experience in. And I thought, this is cool. I can learn, be part of this brand new field. And also, it seems like a great way of thinking about telling stories. I can reconstruct the past using DNA and use that to really figure out what it is that caused some species to become extinct and others not to become extinct. And maybe then we could even use that information to make more informed decisions about how we're choosing to use the limited resources we have to protect species going forward.
I love that. And I love that storytelling is the sort of meta skill here that drew you to how do I tell this, you're prehistoric, you're telling story is in the word prehistoric. You're telling a story of the past, and it's really fascinating how you're doing it. It's also really interesting how you really played the long game to get yourself on Joe Rogan's podcast.
That was it.
You could see that was the plan. Yeah.
So I think the funny thing about it is, so every time we would publish a paper, we would have people from the media that would call to talk to us about it because it's cool. You can get DNA from mammoths, and the older things you can get DNA from, the cooler it is, and you can really estimate really cool things like the timing of when populations are growing and shrinking. Or we figured out one year, it was many years ago now, I was with this interdisciplinary team. We were working on St. Paul Island, which is in the Bering Strait. And it was the second last place that mammoths ever lived. We wanted to know, why they went extinct. So we went to St. Paul during the winter, and we drilled a massive core into the only source of fresh water. It's a volcanic caldera, and drilled through the dirt in the bottom. And that dirt sediment contained about 20,000 years of history of St. Paul Island. And then we went through that column, the oldest on the bottom, the youngest on the top, and we took plugs and we extracted DNA. The water there, we learned, became shallow and turbid and salty. So we learned, using ancient DNA and all these other little ecological indicators, that mammoths went extinct on St. Paul Island 5,700 years ago because they ran out of fresh water. There was a drought that caused the whole population to become extinct. Such a cool way of telling a really interesting story. Like, you're an explorer of the past. You get to go back and use all these different tools to solve this mystery of history, prehistory, and actually tell that story. It was pretty fun. It's a really cool way of using all these approaches together.
Yeah, that's amazing. Beth, thank you so much. I could go on for a long, long time because there's so many strands to pull on. Not to make a DNA pun, which I think I might have sort of kind of done right there. Ish. I don't know.
You did that strawberry thing where you get the strands of DNA. You know what I mean? When you extract DNA from strawberries, you can do it with kids.
I've never extracted DNA from strawberries.
That
may be your hobby on the weekends. That is not mine.
We used to do it for science fairs and festivals, because you can take a strawberry. You could do this with a bunch of kids out on the street at a science fair. Smash up the strawberry and put in some isopropyl alcohol or something, and you can separate the DNA out. Pineapple juice will actually separate the DNA from the other components, that the stuff that you get with the strawberry, and then you can whirl it around a stick and go, look, here's DNA. And then kids are like, I'm not eating that. I'm like, did you eat the strawberry?
What? Very cool. Well, I guess now we all have a fun science project to try this weekend. I hope you all enjoyed this special edition of Future Round and Find Out, recorded live from PopTech. It is an amazing conference and community, and I will link to it in the show notes. I also hope you'll join this community and that you'll share this podcast with a friend. Go to futurearound.com.